Pontiac, Hummer, Saturn, Oldsmobile, Oakland, Saab. These car makes were once part of the General Motors family. Today, they belong to history books, and car enthusiasts like us still wonder, did all of them have to be discontinued? What's the story behind one of GM's most controversial decisions? Was it a logical outcome of a decades-long recession, or just a misfortunate set of circumstances? A combo of a few slow years and the ongoing global economic crisis. Car enthusiasts are convinced that if there was a GM brand that had to survive, Pontiac was the one. Insiders, on the other hand, claim that financial troubles were no more than a final nail in the brand's coffin, and that the true reason was bad blood between the GM board and Pontiac management. What about Chevy's role in all of this? Is Pontiac really undercutting GM's most important brand? It's been 15 years since GM pulled the plug on Pontiac. A few more brands like Saturn and Hummer had to go as well. Even Saab, which has always been known for its unique approach to designing cars, ended its 7 decades-long journey. From today's perspective, it's pretty easy to say that these turbulent years, which culminated with the government bailout, have completely changed the course of the American automotive industry. Buckle up, because we're taking you for a quick ride. This is a story about the toughest decisions GM's ever made. This is a classic story of selling your soul to the devil just to save what can be saved. What exactly happened during those hard years, and why did all those brands have to die? Let's try to find an answer. Pontiac, the love we'll never get over. General Motors, America's largest automaker, a corporation that at its peak had a full dozen famous domestic and international brands under its umbrella, a company with importance on a national level that goes way beyond profit and the economy in general. The history of GM is full of amazing achievements, but it's also filled with decisions that are pretty hard to understand from today's standpoint. And when we talk about decisions that are hard to understand, we all know what bothers GM fans the most. That would be the demise of one of the most exciting American car makers, Pontiac. Named after the legendary chief who bravely resisted colonial encroachment and strived to protect his people's land and way of life, Pontiac was acquired by General Motors in the early 1930s. But throughout its whole history, GM never managed to subdue the brand completely. At first, it was under Oakland's patronage, but that didn't last long, as Pontiac outshone its parent company in a record short period. The original idea was to make Pontiac a companion brand, which would be positioned a little bit lower in terms of luxury and exclusivity. But Pontiac was way more successful. Oakland simply wasn't able to keep up with the changes in customer preference, so it was discontinued in 1931. However, its legacy continued to live through Pontiac's logo, which represents the head of the famous Indian chief, after which the initial Oakland cars were named. Then there was the company's unwavering struggle to release its own V8 engine, which finally ended in 1955 when Pontiac got the green light to go with its own unit. Then the 1960s came, and the brand's most glorious era began. Of course, it all started with the GTO, that sports car icon that it was at the time it was introduced, and that was in 1964, way ahead of pretty much everything else GM had to offer. A 389 cubic inch V8, rated at 325 or 348 horsepower, was the heart and soul of the GTO, along with a full pack of advanced technicalities, such as a floor shifter, upgraded suspension, more direct steering, and even an optional limited slip differential. The GTO instantly cemented its place as one of the most iconic muscle cars of all time. But that was just the beginning. Soon after, Pontiac released another high performer, the iconic Firebird, Camaro's cooler cousin that had aligned with the free spirit of young Americans like anything GM offered before. And then the gas crisis came, which was an initiator of a slow regression that characterized the next several decades. Pontiac managed to keep its image and popularity among young gearheads, but it never really reached the stars again. Of course, there were a few, let's call them incidents, such as the Holden-sourced G8. The Australian automaker has been an integral part of General Motors since 1931. It left a significant mark down under, with models like the Holden Ute and Commodore, which shaped the Australian automotive industry. The latter was eventually introduced to the American market with the aforementioned G8 moniker. Equipped with V6 and V8 engines, with strong overall performance, it was Pontiac's last try to get back on track. But it was too late. It came in 2008 when bankruptcy was already around the corner. Pontiac had already lost its relevance in GM's hierarchy. That process was slow and sometimes very painful for true lovers of the mark. Pontiac reached the bottom in the late 1990s and early 2000s when the company literally insulted hardcore fans with things like the Aztek or the Transport minivan. It all escalated even more when Pontiac launched a Daewoo-inspired subcompact. And if that wasn't enough, the management was so insolent that they named it the Le Mans, a nameplate that was once used for a striking two-door coupe and convertible muscle car. To give you a better picture, the Korean automaker acquired by GM in 2002 was focused on simplicity and affordability, and it was never particularly good at making quality cars. Unlike Hyundai or Kia, it never managed to make that leap and catch up with Western automakers. It remained a maker of lousy cars, and in this particular case, Pontiac rebadged a vehicle that was based on the old Opel Kadett on a platform that dated back to the early 1980s. At that point, we all knew Pontiac had lost its track. The final nail in the coffin. All these odd models were a clear indicator that the GM board didn't really know how to revitalize the once prestigious brand. Sales were down, the company was losing big money, and it seemed like there wasn't much left to do. Then Bob Lutz came and tried to bring Pontiac back once more, with the idea to reestablish its status as GM's sportiest brand and make it kinda like an American BMW. This try included several interesting moves, including the revived GTL, which was imagined as a modern muscle car to compete with the latest Mustang. And while that model was accepted pretty well by critics, GM never planned mass production. The problem with Pontiac was long-lasting. With decades of slow regression, Pontiac came to the point where it wasn't just unprofitable, it was a company that had completely lost its identity. A company that was selling rebadged Chevrolet models. Pontiac would take Chevrolet models, do some minor style tweaks, and put on its own badges. The Pontiac G5 was nothing more than a rebadged Chevy Cobalt. The Torrent was a restyled Equinox, while the Montana SV6 was actually a Chevrolet Uplander. But the problem wasn't in the rebadging. That was and still is a pretty common practice among car makers. The problem occurred when, in order to gather more customers, Pontiac started selling its models at lower prices than Chevrolet. Pontiac was undercutting GM's most important and most profitable brand, and that had to stop. Bob Lutz and others who still believed in Pontiac weren't successful. The board didn't want to listen. Guys with briefcases only see one thing: profit. So it was hard to justify further investing in what they called a lousy brand that hadn't generated any profit in years. Combined with all those pathetic models launched in the early 2000s, which completely killed youthful buyer enthusiasm, the inevitable death of the brand was around the corner. The final years of the first decade of this millennium brought the largest economic crisis since the Great Depression. GM was in terrible shape, near collapse. The only way to get out of this mess was to declare bankruptcy and get help from the government, or better yet, the taxpayers. Yeah, we all paid GM management to kill Pontiac. The bailout conditions were extremely demanding, and the government was persistent with its requirements to kill a certain number of unprofitable brands. GM officials of the time like to point out that this was the toughest decision of their careers. Eventually, it came to choosing between Pontiac and Buick. Founded in 1903, Buick always had a special place in GM's history as one of the oldest American automakers, famous for its valve-in-head engine that brought the revolution in terms of efficiency, not to mention the brand's role in forming General Motors back in 1908. Anyway, one of them had to go. While enthusiasts had no dilemma about which one should stay, considering that no one cared about Buick back in the day, the board had different plans. And no, it wasn't really about history and old merits. Here's the thing. Buick was a big deal in China, and to the management, that was the only thing that mattered. After 84 years filled with ups and downs, Pontiac ended its journey. The 2009 plague. With the ongoing financial crisis and striving to survive, General Motors had no other option but to kill a few less or more iconic brands. But actually, it all started way before 2009, meaning that the financial crisis was just the last drop in the ocean of GM's troubles. The company had been neglecting some of its more iconic brands for decades, and all of this came as a logical outcome. The first case of pulling the plug happened already in 2004, when the Oldsmobile hit the end of its road. What's particularly intriguing is that this is the oldest General Motors brand. GM's board didn't have much sense for history and legacy. This was a fight for survival, so all those Oldsmobile achievements, such as the first mass-produced car or hydromatic transmission, didn't really mean much. Again, Oldsmobile was heavily neglected, with the lineup of numerous antique models and a few more rebadged cars with no identity. The profit was lacking, while taking the brand to the 21st century seemed like too much trouble. It was easier to just obliterate it. Then the aforementioned financial crisis came, and things escalated quickly. This was one of the largest bankruptcies in U.S. history, as GM managed to accumulate nearly $173 billion in liabilities. At the same time, the company's assets were estimated at around $82.3 billion, so the government had no other option but to step in and protect the company that was employing over 90,000 employees back in the day. The U.S. Treasury provided about $49.5 billion in loans, but it would take years before GM would get back on its feet. Meanwhile, 14 plants were closed, and many workers lost their jobs. Unprofitable brands needed to go, and Pontiac was just one of many that were set to take place in front of GM's platoon. The same year, the company also announced the end of Hummer. GM needed a new structure, and in that structure, there was no place for unprofitable and unsustainable brands. Hummer was on the list because these were no longer the 1990s. Customer preferences had changed, and with high gas prices, the focus was on fuel-efficient cars. The Hummer, with its large HD SUV feel and poor fuel economy, it wasn't exactly in line with the new trends on the market. Moreover, it even faced massive criticism from environmental activists, which created quite a negative perception in the market that was becoming eco-conscious. Bob Lutz said that Hummer never should have been a brand, but rather a vehicle in the GMC lineup. And fast forward to 2024, that's exactly what we're seeing with the new electric GMC Hummer. Hummer, the brand, was a mistake going in, he underlined. Saturn was another GM brand discontinued in 2009. Even though it was among the youngest, it managed to change its image completely within 2 decades. Originally formed in 1985, Saturn came as GM's idea to offer smaller, simpler, and more efficient cars, something that would successfully compete with the Japanese. But the 1990s brought a big change. Suddenly, everyone was making cars like these, including sister companies. Saturn, on the other hand, moved away from its initial mission and started offering larger and more expensive, often rebadged Chevy models. It was no longer the same company. It undermined itself, so phasing out was inevitable. When we look at the circumstances, we think this was probably the easiest decision of all. Finally, let's not forget about Saab, probably the most unique car company of all in GM's portfolio. Since its early days, Saab has always been famous for doing things in its own way. And why wouldn't it be? It was originally a defense company, and it entered the automotive industry after World War II, and throughout its whole history, it remained true to its original nature. It never lost its identity, whether it's about the implementation of new technologies or a unique Scandinavian design approach. We could mention that Saab was a pioneer of turbocharging technology, or the company's aerospace industry roots and emphasis on aerodynamics. And just like Volvo, Saab was fully committed to crash safety. It was the first company to make seatbelts standard equipment, and probably the biggest advocate for child safety back in the day. But being unique brings the risk of being unaccepted, and that's exactly what happened. The company has been going through financial difficulties for decades, which all culminated in the 1980s. With a commitment to high safety and engineering excellence, Saab's production costs were significantly higher compared to most competitors. In 1988, the company reported a $160 million loss, and the following year brought record low sales, with only 78,000 deliveries around the globe. It was time for a change, so Saab was restructured into an independent company and sold to General Motors and the Swedish investing company Investor AB. Each company controlled 50% until 1999. When Investor AV stepped out, while GM spent another $125 million to be in full control. But from the very beginning, the GM board didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't a genuine luxury brand, but it wasn't mainstream enough either. It was a brand with a very limited market potential, loved by a handful of enthusiasts. Some suggested a sale, but after a couple of rounds of second thoughts, the year 2009 came and that was no longer an option. The only thing left was to kill the Saab brand in 2012. Killing Opel. Almost. General Motors had a strong presence in parts of the world like Europe, mainly through Opel, which was and still is one of the key players on the old continent. It was part of General Motors for decades, and during all these years, it had ups and downs. Just like the rest of GM car makers, years of global economic crisis were tough. It's estimated that only in 2008, Opel's losses were between $1.8 and $2.5 billion. It was a synergy created by high production costs and declining sales, and by 2009, the market share in Europe was 7.9%, down from 9.2% in 2007. Opel's contribution to GM's disaster was decent, but discontinuing the brand was out of the question. Its research and development team was critical for global operations, not to mention its presence in Europe. One of the possibilities was to sell the company and at least get some fresh capital. GM did receive a couple of offers and almost made a deal with Magna International and Sberbank. After some rethinking, the board decided not to sell. Opel was saved, but it wouldn't take much more time before the final departure. After decades of relatively successful cooperation, it was time to turn the page. The German automaker was sold to PSA Group in 2017. Isuzu and Lotus. Lack of vision. GM's aspirations to establish a better position in international markets were backed up by various automotive companies around the world. Unlike Opel, some of them weren't under the full control of the American car maker. Instead, these were more like partnerships, which ensured the successful development of technologies and vehicles. One of those was a collaboration with Isuzu, a Japanese company known for its reliability, durability, and overall capability. It was a long and fruitful collaboration that started way back in the early 1970s when GM acquired a 34% stake. Soon after, the Japanese car maker started providing GM models with its reliable diesel engines, from large pickups and SUVs to small European Opel-badged hatchbacks. Then joint ventures started, including the development of pickups like Colorado and D-Max. But with all those troubles with the core brands we just talked about, GM was forced to cut its stake to just 12% in 2006, and then to only 1% in 2016, which led to the end of collaboration. We could also mention GM's cooperation with Lotus. Do you remember that 1990 ZR1 with an all-aluminum V8 engine, advanced suspension setup, and performance never seen in a Corvette? Or maybe the Lotus Omega with its magnificent 3.6-liter twin-turbo V6 that puts out 377 horsepower? That was one of the fastest sedans of the time, but the collaboration between the companies was way beyond specific models. The famous sports car maker brought something much more important. It brought knowledge. Through its consultancy service, it helped GM finally become a modern car maker with advanced chassis design, competitive handling, and overall performance. But once again, GM management showed the world what it does best, making the wrong decisions. Suddenly, they decided that it was time to put more focus on core development, so Lotus was sold to Bugatti in 1993 for about $48 million. Even today, it's kind of hard to explain why this happened, but at least GM made some profit, considering that it bought Lotus for $32 million back in 1986. Today, the only thing left is sorrow, because GM hasn't just killed off some of its brands, it changed the course of the American automotive industry in the way that it killed a bit of that impressive diversity of American brands. In today's world where all cars look the same, we really miss the diverse approach GM has been practicing for decades. We miss Pontiac a lot. Its ability to captivate free-spirited young generations with models like the GTO, Firebird, or Trans Am. Those more peculiar gearheads certainly miss the unique designs of Saab models, as well as the famous Aero badge that was used for the hottest models in its lineup. We're not really delighted with the electric Hummer, which just made us feel even more nostalgic about the first 3 iterations, even though they definitely had their flaws. Saturn probably isn't something we miss all that much, but we can only imagine what Lotus's assistance would mean in today's world of hypercars. Oh, and we almost forgot the guys from Down Under, where Holden ended its journey after 168 years because GM decided it wouldn't produce right-hand drive vehicles globally anymore. GM's history is crowded with odd decisions, and as time passes by, we're more and more convinced that most of them were wrong. It seems like GM was never able to pick the right leadership, one with a clear long-term vision, one that can see a larger and more significant picture and set this company on the right track, put it in the place it deserves. In this way, GM continues to lag behind key rivals because it doesn't really seem to care about its brands, its image, its legacy. It just doesn't seem to care. Thankfully, we have so many amazing models to remember from times when General Motors was something different. To summarize, GM has killed 6 brands since 2004. It all started with Oldsmobile in 2004, but we could never imagine that in just 1 year, in 2010, GM would discontinue 3 brands: Pontiac, Hummer, and Saturn, each with its own unique history and contribution to the automotive industry. Saab ended its journey 2 years later, while the final act was 4 years ago when Holden ended its presence on the Australian market after more than 160 years. At the moment, there are no signs of future discontinuations, but with a car maker like General Motors, you never know.